Your eyes on the times, you walk ready to speak up. But with so many problems, you're exhausted trying to keep up.
This is the Church Politics Podcast, where you can get political commentary from a biblical worldview. We're not trying to be conservative or progressive. We're trying to be Christian in the public square.
And I'm black as heaven. I'm made in God's image. Nobody can change my settings. Hey man, got off my knees and put an end to my search. It's easy to sell your soul when you don't know what it's worth.
What you know, good and camp? You're listening to the And Campaign's Church Politics Podcast with Justin Giboney, a.k.a. Bishop Cooper's grandson, and the Windy City representative, the baddest brother above the Mason-Dixon line, my play cousin, the Right Reverend Christopher Butler. Chris, unless you've been under a rock or you're over 50, and I think even if you're over 50, you might have still heard about this. Everybody's been raging about this rap beef between Kendrick Lamar and Drake. They've both written several songs, you know, a beef. And just for those of y'all that might not know, a beef is really when two rappers get into a confrontation and they take it on wax, right? So they start making songs about each other. And there's a long history of rap beefs, right? You got Jay-Z and Nas. You got, you know, all the stuff that was going on in New York even before that. You got Tupac and Biggie, right? Which is probably the biggest one. And I've kind of talked openly, Chris, about the tension that I feel as a Christian listening to hip hop, right? Because I do think there's some stuff that we shouldn't be listening to. I think there's some stuff that's art that is, you know, that we can listen to. Where to draw that line? I'm gonna be honest with you. I don't always get right where to draw that line. Mm-hmm. But insofar as there is a kind of tension in being a Christian and knowing where to draw the line on what type of hip hop you listen to, and shout out to all the Christian artists who are Christian. I mean, to all the hip hop artists that are Christians. It's interesting to think about how a Christian should think about a rap beef, right? Because on one hand, we know through the history of rap beefs, they can become violent. That they do involve a lot of pride, a lot of hitting people where it hurts. And in most cases, they're not necessarily constructive. I think we can, you know, be honest about that. Now, most rap beefs, prominent rap beefs, don't end up in somebody getting shot and things like that, but it has happened before, okay? The other side, I think, is it's kind of sport, right? So are we making too much of it when it is just sport and it is just kind of competing? Because the basis of a lot of rap is, this is who I am. This is why I'm a better MC than you. That's like the nature of rap in a lot of ways, right? I don't know hardly any rapper that hasn't basically said, I'm a better rapper than you. You know what I'm saying? That's just the bravado that comes along with it. I'm trying to find a place to say, okay, is this just sport, or is this something Christians should completely run away from because it can become violent? What are your thoughts on that kind of artistry and where Christians should find themselves within that conversation?
I don't know necessarily what to tell Christians to find themselves. I would say that. I think it's kind
Thanks,
of
Pastor Chris. I thought you were going to answer that. I thought you were going to give us the definitive answer on that.
You know, I think about like something like what do you call it? WWF is not called that anymore. That's what it was called when I was little. But like wrestling, right? So pro wrestling, they do like very similar type storylines, and
Right.
You know, I suppose it has, you know, still their potential to become violent. I don't necessarily know most of this, but I think if you look quantitatively at the history of like rap beefs, most of them don't become like violent. Mm. So, you know, it's sort of this back and forth. I also think that there is some, like the conversation is not all pointless. I don't know that I would go all the way to say like it is constructive. Right? There are things though being discussed that are cultural, that are, you know, sort of commentary on important things.
Right. There's a social commentary in a lot of this stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Especially in this particular one. So, you know, I think, you know, it's one of those things where the old saints would say, eat the meat and spit out the bones. Um, there is some useful components to it in terms of social commentary, certainly in terms of like entertainment value.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that's sort of where I come down on it. Is like eat the meat, spit out the bones. I was telling you before we started recording, I sat around for probably 45 minutes last night with my, and this is compelling about it, right? Because I was with my mother, my grandmother, my brother, and my sister, and we were all engaged on this conversation about
Oh
this rap
wow.
beef. So because this one has like we started talking about it because I mentioned to my brother that when I opened my New York Times email on yesterday, the first story in the New York Times email was about Kendrick Lamar and Drake
Right.
and a rap beef. So it's reached a level of intrigue where people who's I mean it's if your job or your leadership requires you to be in the know, I mean you're pastoring a church or something like that. I always tell folks like just because you don't listen to it, if you're a pastor, like just because you don't listen to it doesn't mean your people are not listening to it. It just means that you don't know what your people are listening to.
That's real.
And so I think
So
it's reached a level with this particular one where it's certainly
yeah.
worth knowing something about it.
Yeah, I mean, some people would say this hurts hip hop because, as we say, sometimes this can become violent. It certainly is, you know, people taking serious shots at one another, and
Yeah.
there are some people that get hurt in that regard. And then other people would say this is what revives hip hop. Like hip hop needs this to wake up and bring the best. It kind of brings the best out of the two guys. At least it's supposed to.
Yeah, I think
So
you're
there's
much more
different
of a
sides of it, but it's definitely worth looking at.
hip hop guy than I am. What do you think on that question? Is this
I think
breathing
it's
fresh
both.
life
I don't,
or
I think I don't see how you have hip hop without that kind of like I'm the best guy here,
yeah.
right? And that part to me, it's entertainment, and it does that competition does we have seen it bring the best out of people, and then there's that negative side, which I think we have to be very clear on not applauding,
Yeah.
because we say a lot of rap beats don't end in death, but then if you go to drill music, which I think is a little different, it's all about like, and that's not even right. I think those are beefs that turn into rap that what I'm saying, that
Yeah.
really about street stuff anyway. So that's a whole nother, to me, a whole nother category. But I think there's a benefit to it. I think we have to be careful. I do see it as sport to a certain extent, but I
Mhm.
think there needs to be some caution for Christians on that. So, I mean, Chris, we got a lot to talk about. And as you know, we always want to give a shout out to our patrons and our supporters for supporting us in what we do and how we do it. You listen to us, I'm guessing, because we talk about stuff in a way that most people either won't talk about or won't talk about it in the way that we talk about it. Because we do that, it forecloses a lot of opportunities for funding because we might say something that polite society doesn't like.
Yeah.
Therefore, a lot of folks don't want to have their name associated with something. And mind you, we're always respectful, we're always compassionate, but we're trying to be faithful, right?
Yeah.
And so that forecloses a lot of opportunities for funding. We need you guys so we can be independent media and make sure that we are able to say what needs to be said. We're always going to do that. The question is, will we have the resources to continue? And so far, we have been blessed by you all, and we ask for continued blessing. So if you're watching on YouTube, make sure that you like and subscribe. If you want to be a patron, you can go on patreon.com/churchpolitics. If you do that and become a monthly giver, you will get our premium episodes. So after we record this, we're going to record another episode. This one's going to be about Mayor Mosby in Baltimore and whether, what she's receiving after being convicted, what the time she might receive, is that fair, and what's going on there. So there's always more conversations that we're having. For you to get to it, we just need you to be a patron. All right. All right. So let's get into it. Grab your Bible, get your mind right, and prepare to think not like a Republican, not like a Democrat, but to think like a Christian. Chris, the second half of Proverbs 18:12 says, humility comes before honor. When we are not humble, we rush towards folly. We eventually destroy ourselves. Narcissus was a character in Greek mythology. And this character fell in love with himself. He was enamored with his own reflection. He was the personification of self-absorption. He ends up dying of thirst and starvation because he couldn't pull himself away from his own image as reflected in a pond. This is where the name of the personality disorder, narcissism, comes from. The American Psychological Association defines it as excessive self-love and egocentrism. It often manifests in a need for admiration. The applause of others becomes an idol and will do all manner of foolishness to gain recognition and praise from others. John 12:43 says, "For they loved human praise more than the praise of God." Chris, if we're honest, some of us might be able to identify that trait in ourselves. If we're honest, if we're willing to examine ourselves in that way. But it seems very prominent among public figures, celebrities, and in many cases, Chris, politicians are driven by narcissism. Now, today, your average person runs away from the scrutiny and often the unfair intrusions in their personal life that come with running for office. But some people don't run away from that. Now, there are people who overcome that scrutiny or overcome their fear of that scrutiny based on the strength of their passion for the people. There are certainly those politicians, and I have friends who I know that are running for that reason. If we're going to be honest, Chris, others overcome that scrutiny because we often ask, man, why would somebody even want to run for office with all the scrutiny you get? Well, let me tell you, some people overcome it through naked ambition and a desire to be seen and applauded. Being criticized is small to the applause that they get on the other side. Now, I've heard the feeling, and you've run, I haven't run for public office in the same way. I've heard the feeling of running for office described as catching the bug. Once people get the feeling that comes with running for office or being in office, in many cases, they just can't stop. It's an urge that just won't go away. At best, they'll do anything to stay in office, and in many cases, they fiend for higher office, for more applause, and for more prestige. Chris, my sons and I have been watching The Lord of the Rings quite a bit lately, and I kind of liken this to what happens to Smeagol and the Ring, with the Ring, right? The Ring, in this analogy, as he calls it, precious, right? Mm-hmm. Is being in elected office. The Ring is the recognition. It's the privilege that comes along with that space. Now, to be clear, Chris, I want to be very clear. I'm not impugning all people who run for office, right? There are a lot of politicians that do it for the right reasons. Like most of us, some people have mixed and conflicting motivations, right? We're all very complicated. So maybe it's a little of a lot of things for different people. The point I'm trying to make here, Chris, is that some politicians are dealing with a sort of brokenness, and it's important for us as voters, it's important for us as Christians to be aware of that brokenness, right? We should be careful about being excessive in our praise. And I've said this many times, Chris, this is why I think that politicians need to be treated with respect, but need to be treated more like servants than exalted leaders. Mm-hmm. In addition to respect and encouragement that we should give to our elected officials, because it's not an easy job and it takes a lot of their time, they also need reality checks, and they also need to be held accountable from us for, we need to bring that accountability to the conversation. Unless they find themselves, otherwise they might find themselves spiraling out of control. And I think a good example of this, and one of the reasons that I brought it up, is South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem, who has really just made herself look very silly over the last few weeks. It's actually getting to the point where it's almost sad, and she does not seem to have the self-awareness to slow down on what's going on. Now, apparently, Noem was near the top of Trump's short list for vice president. And she's trying to, I think, capitalize on this with a new book that she's put out. And this new book, Chris, is getting her in a lot of trouble. At one point in the book, she talks about shooting her puppy. And I think this was meant to make her look strong. As we know, I think a lot of female politicians, especially when they're running for national office, have to overcome, I think, the false idea that they won't be tough enough, right? And so sometimes they emphasize stories that show them being tough. Killing a puppy was just a terrible story to tell, and it's really backfiring on her right now. People are like, why in the world would you shoot a puppy? And that was supposed to help her. The next one that I heard was that she talks about a meeting that she had with Kim Jong-un, and goes into detail about that meeting. And now she's kind of being forced to admit that meeting never happened. Outside of a sort of kind of narcissism, outside of a deep and unhealthy desire to just have elected office and rise in elected office, what can explain this? So, Chris, I guess what I'm asking you is generally talk to me about the narcissism that can come along with being a politician, not always. And then we can kind of go more specifically into what's going on with Kristi Noem.
Yeah, I think you hit on some of the major themes, and it is a problem in our particular political environment. I don't necessarily know that it has to be inherent to the democratic political system, but the way we do politics and campaigns sort of embeds this issue. So I ran for office, and I do think that service is the appropriate motivation to aspire for elected office, a role, a field that we also call public service. And so that's like the right motivation. And I think that a lot of people go for public office in the spirit of service. But the political campaign itself in the modern environment is an exercise in the art of self-promotion, right?
Right.
Many of the campaigns that we see in the modern context don't really break along sort of policy lines. Like, people don't necessarily get elected because they have the best ideas and the best policies. It's so very identitarian, it's so very personality driven that it becomes an art in the practice of self-promotion. And so the people who actually succeed, and I've experienced this in a number of campaigns where I feel like, and I can honestly say, like, campaigns that I have won and lost. If you look at that campaign, you could probably see that there was somebody else in the race who might have been a better public servant, but they're a terrible candidate in the modern context because they've got great ideas, they know how to lead and that type of thing, but they're just really bad at self-promotion. And the person who won because they're really good at self-promotion. So that first cut is almost like cutting out the people who are less gifted in that particular endeavor of self-promotion. And then the way we treat our politicians once they get in office, we don't treat them like servants. We treat them like rock stars and celebrities. And so that, again, like, feeds that ego. So I'm not like delusional. There is a level of ego that has to come with anybody running for any office. You look around your district of whatever size, and you say to yourself, out of all of the 50,000 people who live in this aldermanic ward, I'm the one who should represent the ward in city council. There's a level of hubris to that already. But when you look at the way our modern campaigns work, we almost are recruiting people who are given, or at least good at self-promotion. Then we treat them like celebrities, which feeds that beast. And so I think there are some things that we got to try to change when we think about our broader politics. And I love your reference to the Lord of the Rings, because that is what, as Christians, we really have to be careful of, that we don't become worshipers of the ring. We don't become worshipers of the power, to the extent that we begin to contort our sort of like Christian personhood and personality in strange ways because of the ring of power, right? Like, and it is so very enticing that we we do ourselves very good to be careful of that. And it's important to point out that in all of the whole Lord of the Rings saga, there's only one person, not even Gandalf, ultimately, only one who's ever able to like possess the ring and actually like not be overtaken by its allure. That's Samwise, for those who don't know, Samwise Gamgee. But it's terribly enticing, and we do ourselves a massive disservice if we don't understand that coming into it, and help that shape how we enter, if any of us run for public office, how we enter into that endeavor, and also help us interpret how we should treat people in public office, not only for the sake of the church, but also for the sake of the elected official themselves.
Yeah. And one of my pet peeves, but for a good reason, not just a petty reason, is politicians coming into the church and just being exalted and folks falling all over them and all like that. I really think that's a bad practice and needs to change. Because as you point out, so much of this is just self-promotion, right? It's creating a vibe, creating an aura that fits your constituency and that they will buy into, whether it's true or not, whether you plan on doing the right thing or not.
Yeah.
Christians have to be able to cut through that. Absolutely. To get to the substance, to make sure that people are doing what they're supposed to do, to make sure that people understand that they're going to be held accountable. And too often, it's just not happening. We buy into the vibe, we buy into the narratives that people are selling. We're focused on who can beat up the other side the most, who looks like us, who makes us feel good, who can talk like us. And we miss out on a lot there, but we're not helping them either. Right. Yeah. So we should be in a situation where we can look and say, look, I know the temptations that come along with running for office. I know what kind of landmines you can hit. And one of those landmines is this type of narcissism, is seeing yourself too highly. And I'm going to be honest with you, to keep you away from that. That's not just good for society. That's good for the person themselves. Anything else on that, Chris?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're completely right, and I think because of this, it's what feeds into something like when you look at somebody like Kristi Noem, who's the governor of South Dakota. She's governor of South Dakota, and you're like, how in the world could you be doing like something this crazy? But I think it's usually because people at that level have been getting away with this for so long, right. with just been able to tell half truths, say crazy stuff, do the most. Nobody holds them accountable for it, and so they get into that rhythm, and they don't fall until they get to that really high place where the scrutiny is so broad, where somebody outside of their circle of influence is going to just do a simple little Google search and be like, Governor Noem, you never met with Kim Jong-un.
You never met with him. Why would you even come up? But you're right. I think, especially after years, they get so used to making stuff up and not being called out that they'll just do it. And to put it in a book is crazy. But the interesting thing is, Trump is like the personification of this, right? Like, this is where like the extreme of this is Trump just going out and saying whatever. And I know folks don't want to hear this. Biden's not the greatest when it comes to this. Like, Biden makes a whole
lot of stuff. And it's not just because of his age. He's been doing it a long time.
Right. This isn't to say they're equivalent in general, but I think we have two very good examples of folks that just kind of go out there and say anything.
Yeah.
And Noam, everybody's wondering, like, why you got caught in these lies. Why do you keep going on interviews without different talking points or without apologizing just to make yourself look worse? And it's like she can't pull herself out of it. My diagnosis was kind of a narcissism that comes along with sometimes being a politician, but who knows, man? It is kind of sad to watch.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that narcissism is baked in, and by the time you've been doing it and doing it successfully for decades and just going up and up and up, it's probably terribly difficult to make yourself stop.
Yeah, I agree. We will be right back on the Church Politics Podcast.
Your eyes on the times, you walk ready to speak up. But with so many problems, you're exhausted trying to keep up.
This is the Church Politics Podcast, where you can get political commentary from a biblical worldview. We're not trying to be conservative or progressive. We're trying to be Christian in the public square.
And I'm black as heaven. I'm made in God's image. Nobody can change my settings. Hey man, got off my knees and put an end to my search. It's easy to sell your soul when you don't know what it's worth.
And we are back on the Church Politics Podcast with Justin Giboney and the Right Reverend Christopher Butler. Chris, one of the most harmful ideas floating around society today is that people in the same identity group shouldn't critique one another. Mm-hmm. I've seen a number of people basically call this type of collective self-examination self-hate. Which I think, Chris, and you know this, I think that's ridiculous because how can we improve if we don't issue honest and constructive in-group critiques? How do we improve if that happens? I think that mentality is a recipe for stagnation and a recipe, well, let me say this. I think it's a recipe for stagnation at best. Mm-hmm. And that it's a recipe for a very nasty regression at worst. Well, in that vein, Chris, a few weeks ago, Black thinker Dr. Michael Eric Dyson critiqued Black people, which, like I said, I think he has every right to do. And then we'll critique what he had to say after you hear this. Go ahead, Sloofa, play that clip of Dr. Dyson.
Because I'm going to tell you what, if more Republicans weren't racist, a lot more Black people would be Republican. We're reactionary. We are conservative. We're homophobic. We're transphobic. We are made for the Republican Party. But you hate niggas.
Basically, what we get from this clip, or what I got from this clip, Chris, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that Black people are reactionary, conservative, homophobic, and transphobic. That Black people were actually made for the Republican Party, and but for the racism in the Republican Party, Black people would likely be Republicans. Again, Dr. Dyson is entitled to his critique. I actually appreciate when people say what they mean, even when it isn't pleasant. His job is not to say things that make me and Chris feel good about ourselves. His job is to call it like he sees it. And even though I think he's wrong, very wrong, in my critique, I will try to avoid ad hominem, meaning going against the man. I don't want to have any personal attacks. So I'll try to avoid ad hominem and slander and just address his argument, even though I have differences with him stylistically and substantively. Now, Chris, you recall that, man, it had to be maybe a couple decades ago, a decade and a half, something like that, that Dr. Dyson criticized Bill Cosby for his pound cake speech at Morehouse. And if you haven't heard this speech, this is a speech where I think it was at a commencement or something where Bill Cosby just kind of went in, and I think he starts talking about, you know, the names that Black people give their kids and all this other stuff. And it really just became a kind of classist, unconstructive, you know what I'm saying? Like, it just wasn't a constructive conversation, right? It wasn't constructive on a number of points. That doesn't mean he didn't have any points, but on a number of points, it was like, come on, man, you're losing. And I think some of it was hyperbole, but it just didn't go over right.
Yeah.
But when I listen to what Michael Eric Dyson has to say here, I don't think he's being any less condescending. Like, he criticized Cosby for being condescending, but I think this is condescending. I don't think every examination of your culture is condescending. Like, examination within itself is not condescending, but this is condescending. Mm-hmm. I found it to be kind of just a backhanded statement. Like, he's basically saying that Black people aren't progressive enough for him, and that anything that isn't progressive is unthoughtful and hateful. part of what I think he's doing here, though, Chris, is kind of a reverse psychology, right? He's basically trying to shame people, black people, out of being socially conservative on a number of issues. Mm-hmm. That's the implication that I got, that he was saying this, but he really wanted to say, well, I don't want to be like that. So I need to, I need to change how I think, right? And it's this whole fake conflation of white thought and kind of traditional values, as if white people wrote the traditional, as if modern white people wrote the traditional values in the Bible. Anybody that has seen Unspoken by Jude 3 knows that is not the case, but that is kind of the false history that a lot of people are putting out there, the false narrative that people are putting out there. Now, in my opinion, Chris, this line of reasoning displays a lack of moral knowledge. We can talk about intelligence. We can talk about evolving, whatever you take that to mean. But we also need to talk about moral knowledge, which is an understanding of God's design and God's moral composition and how they lead to order and flourishing. Hate and stupidity aren't the only reasons that someone might not agree with homosexuality or trans ideology in practice. Now, I'll be the first to say, and we've said this before, if you dislike the people or if you have a strong fear of the people, then that is a major problem. That might, that does fit into the category of a phobia. But if you don't support the practice or the ideology, the root isn't necessarily in malice or ignorance. Telling someone who was born a man that they can be a woman is not truthful, compassionate, or helpful, in my opinion. There is a very logical argument in favor of that opinion, too. Because what I'm seeing is that in the spirit of Foucault, in the spirit of Nietzsche, who, by the way, weren't black either, right? Dyson has placed too high a value on self-indulgence instead of an appreciation of moral law and the realities that humans might find inconvenient, but don't control and aren't able to escape. This argument, Chris, what I'm saying is that it lacks wisdom and that it refuses to acknowledge God's design, which even if we set the Bible aside, we can see this design through general revelation. We don't have to be a Christian. Cultures throughout the world, throughout history have seen this, right? The general revelation that the differences between men and women are there, they exist, and how men and women can come together to create something that no other combination of people can naturally create together. That's a major difference. That's not reactionary. That's not hyper-conservative. That's not homophobic. That's not transphobic. That's sound reasoning, and it's a faithful Christian ethic. So what I would say to Dr. Michael Eric Dyson was, can you acknowledge that there might be some reasons for disagreeing with that ideology and disagreeing with those things in practice that are not actually bigoted, that are not actually anti-intellectual? That there have been very thoughtful people that disagree with you, and it's not for those reasons. But I don't think, I think with this, again, I think with the reverse psychology that's being used within his response, it's trying to draw a very clear line to say either you are conservative, and we know that conservatives, especially white evangelicals, have been made to be the perfect foils. Either you're like them or you accept everything else that I say is the opposite of them. Sure. And I think that is actually intellectually lazy, and that is problematic more so than thinking through things differently and acknowledging that intelligent people, well-meaning people can disagree. But go ahead, Chris. What were your thoughts?
Yeah, I think I'll pick up there because given that all those things are true, that this is sort of intellectually dishonest, that it is this kind of like, backhanded compliment, it also then nets in a sort of cultural disrespect, which is probably the piece that frustrates me the most, because what you do in that backhand comment is you go back then and say that your ancestors, that your the people who have come before us, that they had something fundamentally wrong with their sort of moral compass, their ability to navigate the world. They were somehow evil, wicked, oppressive, um, in their personhoods, and that is disrespectful to Black cultural heritage, right? And this like historically inaccurate attempt in the sort of modern day to go back and reinterpret Black cultural heritage through the lens of sort of hyper modern progressivism I think is a disrespect to Black culture, right? Because Black people have endured so much oppression, like real oppression, real injustice in this country, to then go back and say that like the things that we came to believe as we were coming along as a people were are bigoted and reactionary and homophobic and founded on nothing but fear and ignorance. To me, that is to pick up the argument that says if my grandmother didn't have a degree from Princeton, then she does not have the ability to discern in the world what is right and what is wrong.
Right. Which is which is the misunderstanding of moral knowledge. Like moral knowledge doesn't come from Harvard and Princeton.
Yeah.
There were people who didn't have hardly any education at all, including some of our, grandparents who had a moral knowledge that I see a lot of people at Harvard, Vanderbilt, and Princeton not having. Go ahead, Chris.
And so when you take that line of argument, either like intentionally or unawares, you become part of what I think is is still too large chorus of sort of anti-Black commentary that tries to demean, belittle, devalue the contributions of Black people to culture and society, Black American people to culture and society, because there have been folks who have thought hard and long and come to conclusions that I think it would be appropriate to call theological, appropriate to call philosophical, to be appropriate to call ethical, based on the kind of mental work that anybody who went to any university is going to engage in thought work. And folks were engaging in that same kind of thought work as they came through slavery, as they came through Jim Crow. They maybe didn't get a degree for it. They maybe didn't read all of the, sort of smart white German guys. But they did heart work. They did brain work. They came to conclusions. Now, whether you agree with them or not, to discredit thoughtfulness and intentionality around arriving at sort of moral and ethical conclusions, to devalue that in a whole group of people just because they didn't come along a certain road that you came along. I thought that was supposed to be what like the white oppressor was supposed to be up to, not the anti-racist, ordained PhD.
Yeah, I mean, let's be honest. In a way, we have seen for years that the academy, those in the academy, even those that came from the church that are in the academy, look down on the pews, right?
Yeah.
To say, now that I've gone into the academy, I've gotten this special knowledge that allows me to say, I wish you knew what I knew. You guys might be nice, you might be well-intended, but you just don't know, right? It's a sort of elitism that we see coming from the academy that I think has really hurt the Black church. And I think really even further disconnected the academy, those who go in the academy, from the pew. Mm-hmm. Now, one of the things that I think is completely intellectually dishonest about it is they've tried to tell the pew that you're a Black, like they've tried to make progressivism blacker than what is in the pew. basically said the pew thinks what they think because the colonizer has made them think that.
Yeah.
The problem with that is there's no ideology that's more Western. There's no ideology that's been touched by European philosophers and theologians than secular progressivism.
Mm-hmm.
So in one point, in one
much more
way,
modern thinkers too.
Yeah. And so in one way, you're trying to say, well, progressivism is black. And then if you go through the history of that, you can't say that. The Bible is much more influenced by black thought than secular progressivism is. But there's this intellectual dishonesty to kind of put the academy up on a pedestal and look down on the pew, but I still try to maintain the authenticity that we know people on the left are so serious about maintaining. And it just doesn't work that way. Yeah. Again, if you haven't seen the Unspoken documentary, you need to see that, because at the end of the day, to me, an idea isn't good because it's black or because it's white. Yeah. So let me say, I'm calling out the game that I see some of these folks playing. I'm not saying that is the right way to look at it. An idea should be examined and analyzed based on its substance, right? If an idea is good or bad, should be based on the substance. It doesn't matter who it comes from. There are black thinkers who've come up with terrible ideas. There's white thinkers that have come up with terrible ideas, and both have come up with good ideas, all right? But what we have to be honest about is if we're so against Western thought, if we're so against colonization, and the core of our philosophy, secular progressivism, comes from exactly with what we're talking about, then we got to be honest about that. And not try to use this reverse psychology, basically saying, oh, black people, y'all really just like those white evangelicals because you think this or that, as if they made up the idea of traditional ways of viewing family and sex. Yeah. They did not. And anybody who is worth their salt in history knows they did not. And so can we have a real conversation, or are we just going to try to call each other out based on these false narratives?
Yeah. White Americans did not write the Bible. That might come to as a shock to some people, but white Americans did not write the Bible. And black Americans did not embrace Christianity in America uncritically, and just as like a wholesale acceptance of white American culture, right? Like the values and thought inside of the black community, even those values that code conservative in our modern, sort of parlance, are values and thinking that were processed through a community of people dealing with questions, looking at life, reading the Bible for themselves, and coming to conclusions. And again, if you disagree with those conclusions, by all means, disagree with those conclusions. But don't try to discredit those conclusions by saying that the people who came to those conclusions were somehow not qualified or capable to do so. And so you're going to come in with your, educated progressivism and rescue them from themselves. And I guess the part that's like so offensive to me is because it's like Eric Dyson is going to rescue me from my grandmother.
Right.
And it's like, I don't need you to do that, sir. I'm good. So, yeah, I mean, it's frustrating to me for that point, because I would rather, if you're really going to be anti-racist and you really want to like have some of this conversation, which, there is, what really sucks about this is that there is a point to be made about a potential alignment with like conservative political movements and a failure to really reach black people who they should be finding more common ground with, right? There's a conversation to be had there, but you don't even want to really have that conversation. You just want to have this kind of like backhand compliment instead of finding a way to platform somebody like my grandmother and really get into why she thinks the way she does, how she arrived at those conclusions, and what are her critiques of the Republican Party, with which she does not participate.
Right.
So, there is an intellectually honest, thoughtful way to like broach the criticism of the Republican Party that I think he was trying to get to. But by the time you've walked over so many Black people and Black historical culture to get to your point, I'm not even trying to like hear what you're talking about so much.
Yeah, and you're punching against a straw man, right?
Yeah.
You flattened the argument. You've made the argument. I just hate those people. Therefore, that's why I disagree with the ideology and the practice.
Yeah.
There are very thoughtful reasons for those disagreements, even if you end up disagreeing with the conclusions that we might draw.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to say this, with all the issues going on in the Black community, every other issue, every other community has their issues. With all the issues going on in the Black community, I will tell you this: neither conservatism or progressivism is going to save us. And my problem with some of these cats in the academy is, if we were just more progressive, we would be better off. If we just focus more on liberation and self-indulgence, we'd be fine. If we just affirmed everything everybody did, we would actually be in a much better situation. I don't agree with that argument. Yeah. I also don't agree, with a similar argument made from the conservative side. Amen. And so all I'm asking is not that we agree, but that we're able to have a conversation where we're not so dismissive. Yeah. And one of my biggest problems with how he came across was it completely dismissed folks who, like most of us, have family members who are experiencing that stuff, who love them, would sacrifice all we had for them, but happen to disagree with the practice and the ideology. Yeah. Those are different things. And I think that needs to be recognized. Anything else, Chris?
No, I mean, I just hope that we can get to a place where we can have better conversations. And I even hold out hope, Justin, that the Reverend Dr. Michael Eric Dyson might participate in those conversations. I'll hold out hope, but I will not hold my breath.
I would love to see it. We will be right back on the Church Politics Podcast.
Your eyes on the times, you walk ready to speak up, but with so many problems, you're exhausted trying to keep up.
This is the Church Politics Podcast, where you can get political commentary from a biblical worldview. We're not trying to be conservative or progressive. We're trying to be Christian in the public square.
And I'm black as heaven. I'm made in God's image. Nobody can change my settings. Hey man, got off my knees and put an end to my search. It's easy to sell your soul when you don't know what it's worth.
And we are back on the Church Politics Podcast. So I kind of want to give y'all an update on what's going on in Gaza. This is something that we've covered, and we want to keep you updated because it matters. And the difference between this and a lot of other things going on in the world that need to be addressed is, to a certain extent, at least when it comes to resources, the United States is sort of in the middle of this one, right? Yeah. And so I think it's something that we need to talk about. So one of the main issues, and Biden had been fairly clear about this, was basically telling Bibi and Israel, do not invade or bomb Rafah. Rafah is in the southern part of the Gaza Strip, and initially Israel and others were telling people to go to Rafah, to get away from the conflict, right? That's what was going on. Well, what has just happened is Israel has begun invading Rafah, and they're saying, ostensibly to promote the release of all the hostages. They're going into Rafah and they're trying to, they want to get rid of Hamas. Okay. This is major because, again, Biden has told them over and over again, don't do that. Yeah. All right. But they decide to do it. What makes it more interesting to me is that in negotiations, I think that were happening in Egypt, and I know that America had their hands in it, they came to an agreement for a ceasefire that actually Hamas agreed to. Initially, it was being said by America and others, hey, we can't get Hamas to agree to this, but if they agree to this, we can stop the fighting. Well, Hamas agrees to it, which would cause a ceasefire and end this conflict. And yet Israel goes into invading Rafah. Now, to be very clear, Hamas has not stopped trying to, this ceasefire has not gone into effect because there's no agreement. But in this time, it's not like Hamas has stopped trying to kill, Israelis and things of that nature, right? So this has still been going on. Hamas is being Hamas. Some people would even say that they don't trust that Hamas is, they think they're just trying to make a statement, that they really don't want a ceasefire either. Okay. So I do want to be clear about that. But this is, the crazy part about this is the Israeli Defense Force has taken control of the Rafah crossing on the Palestinian side. This is a big deal because this is the most significant entry point when it comes to aid into Gaza. One of the problems that's being had is that aid cannot get into Gaza, and now we have the IDF in control of the Palestinian side of the Rafah crossing, and there are like 600,000 children in Rafah. This is a big deal. A lot is going on here, and instead of getting the ceasefire that it looks like folks are trying to agree to, which I'll be honest with you myself, I don't know. I think, and this was also said on Breaking Points, to a certain extent, I think that Hamas was just trying to call Israel's bluff. That they're not necessarily going to stop right now either, or they're not necessarily all in on this agreement, but may just be trying to call the bluff of Israel. And it looks like they may have, because they're not going to agree to it from what we can tell. But go ahead, Chris, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's a horrible situation, obviously, and as you have already rightly said, the United States is in the middle of it, and I think one thing that would be helpful for this is for us to kind of own up to that fact more readily as a country. I saw something about the United States getting ready to begin to bring in refugees from Gaza, which, okay, but these are going to be asylum seekers who are essentially seeking asylum in America from America, right? Because we are so heavily invested in Israel's, prosecution of this. I guess I'll continue to call it a war, but whatever it is that we qualify it as, that we are investing in this prosecution of it, and it's going to have. I think the other reason that is really important for us to talk about, because this is the Church Politics podcast when we talk about United States politics, and this is going to have tremendous impact, I think, on the upcoming election, because it's going to be a very close election. It's going to be one of those things that breaks around the margins, and if they cannot get to a ceasefire deal, which, when you look at the fact that the United States was in Egypt negotiating, and Israel was not even there, like they didn't have an actual representative, and then you get a ceasefire deal, Hamas accepts it, they publicize it, we publicize it, then Israel is like, no, that's not a deal that we can accept. And they are actually starting to have military action in Rafah, which is the very thing that we told them not to do. And they are doing this thing. And this morning or late last night, President Biden, his administration sort of put out that they don't consider this to be a major military operation. And I'm just like, ask some of the Palestinians who are fleeing for their lives right now, whether if it is a major military operation. They took over this Rafah border crossing, and that Egypt crossing is effectively like the way that humanitarian workers have gone in and out of the Strip, the way most of the aid has gone in and out of the Strip. And so to close that off is a big deal. I think I saw this morning that the WHO said that they only have in Gaza 3 days left of power at the hospitals. The hospitals that are operating, they only have 3 days left on the current resources that they have. So after 3 days of this crossing being closed down, those hospitals won't be able to function anymore. There is famine already in northern Gaza. now these folks from southern Gaza are going back north trying to. It is a complete mess, and somehow you've got to figure out how to get these things tied down, not only for the sake of the people in that region. And when I say the people in the region, I think about Palestinians and Israelis, because this conflict is not helping anybody from that standpoint, and also for the sort of political outcomes of this election. And I'm almost beginning to believe that whether you agree with him or not on the question, that President Biden so strongly believes in his sort of Zionist approach that he's willing to sacrifice his reelection in order to maintain his position on that. So we shall see.
So again, this is all things we're going to continue to keep an eye on. This is serious. I mean, if this spreads beyond, what's going on in Gaza, it becomes a big issue. I will say this, that because I don't know that you mentioned it. If you did, excuse me, Chris. Biden they're saying they have delayed some of our arms shipments to Israel because they have gone into Rafah. But again, where's the red? At some point, it has to be if you're going to receive all this stuff from us, there has to be a level of respect. We're not trying to control you, but that doesn't mean that we have to give you something and you don't listen to our requests and you just kind of do what you want to do.
Yeah.
To go into Rafah and here's what probably happened. I'm guessing, right? I'm not a war strategist. I'm guessing Hamas has embedded itself in Rafah, right? And therefore now they're saying we have to get Hamas, we have to go there because Hamas knew in their foolishness that Rafah was supposed to be a safe space, right? So they go into this safe space to build up and do whatever they want to do. And Israel's saying, no, I get that. Mm-hmm. But we have to also keep in mind that this was supposed to be a place where people were supposed to go to get away from this. So it's a very hard and complicated topic. And I just think that we need to treat it that way. But at the end of the day, something has to give because the rate of women and children dying is not okay. And do you ever get rid of Hamas? I don't know if you ever completely get rid of them, especially not this way, right? I don't think that you beat people into submission and saying there will be no more Hamas. We will no longer be terrorists because you beat us up too much.
Yeah.
What that answer is, I think we have to take the time to figure it out. I'm not going to give you a simple one sentence, but we've got to consider, all those who are being hurt on the Israel side and also on the Palestinian side. Well, guys, you know what it is. As always, we appreciate you listening to us, taking the time to hear our thoughts. We know folks might not always agree with everything we say, but hopefully you think that it does come up from a thoughtful point of view. You know what it is, Ann Camp. There's a cross that neither political conservatism nor progressivism is fit to bear. There's a civic hearing in need of faithful witnesses who love social justice and won't surrender the truth to be loved by the world. Politic with the boldness and compassion of Jesus Christ. Until next time, Ann Camp. We'll holla at you.
Dear Lord.